Hi everybody, welcome to my channel and welcome to my video. Today we're going to be talking about The Handmaid's Tale in connection to our ideas of dystopia and how dystopian fiction can create worlds that are at the same time recognizable but also terrifying and the stuff of our worst nightmares. So basically the title of today's video is going to be Theocracy, The Handmaid's Tale, speculative fiction and the proximity of our worst nightmares. It's quite a mouthful, but that's fine. Okay. So first of all, I just want to start by talking a little bit about Margaret Atwood and the context, because we're going to be thinking a little bit about how she actually perceived the book itself and the topic, and how she decided to construct this world of nightmares, which is Gilead in The Handmaid's Tale. So she's a Canadian writer, and she had an idyllic childhood in Canada. Her father was an insect researcher, and so I love this idea of this small girl watching her father quite romantically roaming around a Canadian forest and looking at insects and studying them. It's quite Victorian, which is quite interesting. So she's a prolific writer. She's produced huge amounts of books. She's won major awards, and The Handmaid's Tale has won awards as well, which is fantastic. And something that I think is important is that she studied at Radcliffe, which is an all-girls university connected to Harvard University. I don't know very much about the university itself, but I know that she studied there. And she studied Victorian novels, Victorian fiction. This is really interesting because she does write a lot about the contemporary world, but it's very interesting to see that her perception of Victorian fiction is that it deals very much with commenting on society as a whole and not just on individual people and their individual lives. And so this is really the perspective framing The Handmaid's Tale, and that's the kind of perspective that we're going to be looking at in terms of The Handmaid's Tale with regard to paper 2 for the IB, social commentary, context, themes, that kind of idea. Okay, so this particular book was written in the early 1980s, and something else I didn't know either was that it was written in West Berlin. And again, I love this idea of Margaret Atwood actually being in West Berlin in the 1980s with a big wall separating West Berlin and East Berlin, and on the other side of it this kind of quite scary behemoth of a Soviet Union, East Germany kind of construction. And so obviously that has some bearing on this idea of what happens on the other side of the border, what happens on the other side of the barrier. So that's quite an interesting context to take away from this as well. In terms of what kind of book it is, Margaret Atwood likes to talk about this as something called speculative fiction, the idea of what if, something that could really happen. If this happened, then this would happen, and something that could actually happen to us, which is, I think, has provoked some rage from others who would say that science fiction would also cross into that line, dystopic fiction also crosses into there as well. But obviously there's going to be elements of all of those different things inside of this particular text. But she herself likes to perceive this as speculative fiction, and so I think that we should respect her wishes and call it that as well. As I said, it is a kind of what if in a not too distant future. It was written in the 1980s, and so obviously that not too distant future is really round about now in terms of where we are in the 2000s. So that's another interesting perspective as well. But I do want to start by thinking first of all about this sort of spinning of a web of a world that she does, Gilead as a world, and how that operates as a construction. Because the setting is really the antagonist of the novel, I think. A lot of people might think that it's Aunt Lydia, a lot of people might think it's the commander, or even Serena Joy. But really, I would say that we have the protagonist, Offred, and also the antagonist, which is really Gilead, this structure, this oppressive, suffocating, dehumanizing structure, political structure. And that creates quite an interesting opposition between the pair of them. So, in terms of how the world was constructed and what's the premise, obviously the book is located in what is the US, although it's not the US, it's Gilead, which is after a religious coup, set up a theocracy there. And a theocracy being an interesting concept as well, because we have the leaders being the direct representatives of God, and the law of the political body being the direct representative of God's will. That creates a very oppressive kind of structure in Gilead, and it diminishes automatically any kind of freedom or resistance, I would say, any kind of resistance to this, because not only are you going up against men and politics and man's law, you're going up against God and God's law. And so automatically the people who are interpreting that law have a credibility or a power that they might not have in another kind of political structure. So this has been constructed as a theocracy, which is interesting. And it basically answers the primary question that I think Margaret Atwood was asking herself when she was kind of conceptualizing the book, which is, if you wanted to remove the liberal democracy of the United States and replace it with something, with a theocracy, how would you go about doing it? How would you actually go from this extreme to the other extreme? I mean, a lot of people might think that the US isn't actually a liberal democracy, but let's work on the assumption that it is, and what those steps would be to take the country from this extreme to absolutely the other extreme, which is quite powerful, isn't it? Like, how would you go about that? What would your cover story be? What would your disguise be? What would your approach? What would your strategy be? And so this book, in a lot of ways, is talking about that, how we can move from this extreme to the other. So obviously it's the story of Offred, but given Margaret Atwood's interest in social commentary in the Victorian novel as talking about society as a whole, this idea of the construction of Gilead is really, really important as well, because obviously Offred's story exists within that framework. Serena's story exists within it as well. And so it's the framework for everything that happens. So it's really important. So Atwood says that, in order to make this happen, your new state could not resemble any kind of communism or any kind of socialism. It would be just too big, too much of a leap, a bridge too far. So what do? How do you remove liberal democracy? And how do you set up this dictatorship or this theocracy? So the first thing would be you would not have communism or socialism of any kind. You would never be able to abolish liberal democracy in that way in the US. And what she says is quite interesting, because she says you can never build a radical government where there's not already a base existing for that government, no matter how long ago it was. And so when she was thinking about how to construct this new sort of theocratical setting for the action in the novel, she doesn't go back to the 18th century or the sort of the Enlightenment of that time. She goes back even further to the 17th century and the Puritans, and uses that as the base, on the assumption that you can't graft something if it doesn't already exist. Okay, so that's quite an interesting premise as well. So she's talking about this idea of a 17th century Puritan New England, like the Scarlet Letter, like the Crucible, this kind of mindset, and how to move people who are essentially in a liberal democracy into that mindset. And what would it take? So, this idea of government leaders being either members of the clergy and representatives of the legal system is powerful. Where am I going with that? I'm not sure where I'm going with that. But anyway, what you would need to do is you would select a few passages from the Bible, maybe take them out of context in order to justify an action. And so very much Old Testament justice. We're not thinking about the New Testament. We're talking about Old Testament justice, picking and choosing some key phrases in order to justify action. We would also have things like privilege and power. Those things, how they're connected. What are the rewards for that? That would also be key in terms of rewarding, I suppose, the believers. What do you get if you believe in this structure? Because obviously this new theocracy depends on people believing in it in order for the revolution to take root, but also for the values of the society to actually become embedded in the new system. And obviously this idea of where fertile women are limited and there aren't that many of them, they suddenly become desirable goods. They're kind of the commodity to aspire to in terms of power and privilege. And again, what that implies is reproductive control. In order for that to happen, in order to make it work, we have to have absolute control over the reproductive capacity of women within the social structure. And that's what they do. It is really interesting as well, like the title of the book itself and how that relates to the message. So obviously The Handmaid's Tale is kind of an allusion to Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And they were written in the 1300s and they talked about, I think it's 24 stories, I'm not sure exactly how many there are, but there's 20-something stories about pilgrims who were going on a pilgrimage to Canterbury Cathedral. And Canterbury Cathedral was famous, it is famous, because this is where Thomas Becket was killed by the Knights of Henry II, who, in a fit of rage, shouted, "Who will rid me of this meddlesome priest?" And 4 knights went and did just that, and they killed Thomas Becket. So this has become a site of pilgrimage for pilgrims. And the idea of the Canterbury Tales is not to support religious figures who are actually within the group of pilgrims, but to mock, to be ironic, to ridicule them for their foolishness and their arrogance and their abusiveness and their greed. And so, although I mean, of course, there's some funny moments. There is, in fact, a fart in one of the Canterbury Tales. So we are talking about one of the most important pieces of writing of medieval times in English, and yes, there is a fart. Okay, anyway, I digress. So basically, the idea of making an allusion to this shows that The Handmaid's Tale is designed to refer and to sort of ask us to offer a very critical eye towards people who are religious and in power, like that crossover between religion and power, and also to fit into this wider context of storytelling that's been going on for years and years and years, using stories, using narratives as criticism, as critique. Okay, so she sees herself within a much wider panorama of storytellers, and you can see that, again, her study of Victorian novels, Charles Dickens, Tolstoy, the people who have influenced her, is quite apparent in the way that she constructs this world and constructs the social commentary of it. And again, not the main, but one of the driving questions behind this is, a question that's been asked throughout the whole of time and through many different religions and through many different political structures and crises. Who's going to have the babies? Who's going to raise the babies? Who's going to be blamed if things go wrong with the babies? And what happens to the babies eventually? What's their purpose? Who has the babies, where, how, why, and who raises them? And that's not a new question. That's something that's been around for ages, and it fits into this wider context of storytelling about the human condition and storytelling about society. And so this is something also is really important in terms of the way that this is constructed and the way that Margaret Atwood decided to construct the story itself. I mean, I see it a little bit like like a negative Harry Potter. Like Harry Potter constructs a world that's our own world, but better. It's got more power, children are empowered, they've got magic, it's quite an exciting world. But it's still our world. Whereas Atwood's constructed the absolute opposite, which is it's our world, but 1,000 times worse. It's hellish, even though it looks nice, it's hellish. And so she was quite conscious and quite deliberate about the way that she did this. We can recognize elements of our own world here. We may not recognize all of them, but we recognize a lot of them. And she made a deliberate and conscious decision to use only elements in the story that actually come from history, that actually come from experience, and that actually is technology that actually exists. So in terms of science fiction dystopia, she's not doing that. She's not inventing new technology. She's not inventing new cruelties or sadisms. She's actually using things and pulling the threads together from different cultures, different experiences, different time frames, and putting them all in one group, which makes it recognizable, also foreign, but at the same time terrifying, because we can see how it all fits together. And so things like group activated hangings, people ripping each other apart, clothing for different levels of society, forced childbearing and taking the children away, children stolen by regimes and given to high-ranking officers, forbidding of literacy and denial of the right to own property. These are not new ideas. These are things that have come from many different traditions. And much as we would like, I suppose, from a privileged, white, educated standpoint, to kind of poo-poo it and say, that's not from my tradition, that's the other. It really isn't, and that's something that we need to acknowledge in this as well, that there's a very long Christian tradition of doing these things as well. Not everything. She's pulling different threads from different cultures and different ideas, but we're in there as well, and there is a complicity there which is quite scary, but also needs to be acknowledged. So while the book seems to be talking about all dictatorships, it's also talking about none of them specifically, because it resonates with our understanding of things that we might have read or heard or seen on TV in terms of the cruelty or the sadism that happens in this world. But it makes it very difficult to sort of put our fingers on it. And again, it's powerful because obviously Gilead, as we were talking about the other day, it is founded on this sort of spirit of utopian idealism, high principles, a return to tradition, going back to morality and going back to the good old days, you know, and that is quite resonant in terms of a lot of the discourse that we hear in politics today. And so this idea of thinking about the book, it has become like a rally, a cry for any kind of contemporary issue which relates to reproductive control or shifting towards controlling women, limiting of rights, limiting of, or I suppose structuring of society in a way that limits individual freedoms. So the book has become so resonant and so clear in terms of its connection, or the way that it represents the what if of what will happen if we go this way. That it has become part of the popular culture, in the sense that the lines between reality and fiction have become very blurred. We now see protesters outside the Washington Monument dressed as handmaids. Kylie Jenner was called out as well for dressing up as a handmaid at a handmaid's party. The idea of the handmaids being representative of any kind of oppression of reproduction or sexuality or individual freedoms has become a really visual signifier. Okay, so we've got this dystopian government of the US within the body of speculative fiction, and it takes place in a highly undesirable society. And we have the protagonist Offred, and we have the antagonist, which is really the setting. And it has taken off as a symbol in terms of discussions about women's rights and theocracies. And again, there's a wider discussion, I think, as well, as what is the role of religion in government? What's the role of religion in politics? Should we expect our politicians to be religious? What does it mean if our national anthem has the word God in it? You know, what happens if the Constitution has the word God in it? Should it be there? What is that the beginning of a slippery slope towards a theocracy? Are there elements of theocracy in different societies? Could we slide towards a theocracy if we're not careful? So this is the underlying question, I think, in terms of the way that the country is constructed and the way that the stages of the coup in the book are constructed as well. Especially because, as with the Canterbury Tales, there's a lot of evidence of hypocrisy and pointing out the injustice of having the most religious being the most empowered, yet having access and desire to engage with temptation. So there's a very clear critique in there as well, which does allude to this idea of the Canterbury Tales being very critical of the religious figures inside the pilgrimage, the group of pilgrims. In an essay about the book that Atwood actually wrote, she does compare The Handmaid's Tale to A Clockwork Orange, 1984 and Brave New World, which have very, very clear political undercurrents as well. And they all do suggest that this is a world which is not so very different to our own. And so when we combine this kind of approach to include the social commentary from the Victorian novel perspective, it does inspire a kind of quiet, cold terror about the fact that we don't seem to be very far away from many of the things that happen in the book. When we've lost our balances and protections, it's very clear the message is this could happen to us. What if? It just takes a small tweak here and a small tweak there, and that could be our possibility. So, you know, I think just to finish in terms of wrapping up this first initial introduction to the book in terms of theocracy and the proximity to our nightmares that Atwood is painting through the construction of Gilead. There's a very clear message there for me, which is that if we stand by and we ignore the violation of individual rights for groups that are not ourselves, small groups, wider groups, it doesn't really matter. But if we stand by and we ignore violations of the little rights, not even little rights, any rights at all, rights are rights. If we stand by and we ignore violations of rights for people that are the other, they are not us, we are on a bit of a slippery slope to the violation of all rights for everybody, including us. So, I mean, this drive towards utopia inside the book drives us towards this kind of death, this sort of death of the spirit inside the inferno that is Gilead. And basically what she's doing, we're looking at the way that this kind of radical adherence to histories which already exist could mean that this could also very, very easily happen to us, and happen to us on our watch. So that is the function really of this speculative dystopia, to tell us, be careful, we're there and it's on your watch. Thank you very much. Okay, all right, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.